Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Visibility Era, the podcast. I'm here today with Kerry Barrett. And of course, as luck would have it, we realize that the online world gets a little bit smaller today when we realize we live 20 minutes from each other in real life. So, Kerry, I'm so excited to have you here today.
Likewise, Bridget, thank you for having me. Yeah, I know. I saw in your LinkedIn profile, I'm like, she's like my neighbor practically.
So funny. Yeah, of course, though. But of course, I originally got contacted and connected with you because I was curious to talk to news anchors and to hear a little bit more about their background, their backstory, and really what it takes to, have a pitch that lands. I know that you've, shifted careers since working in the news world, but I'd love for you to give us like that 20-year background, waking up at 12:30 in the morning. What was that like for you?
It's not pleasant. I love morning TV. So I love, first of all, it's very habitual for viewers. So despite the fact that you may not be seeing them in person, you feel very connected to them. And they also feel very connected usually to the people who are delivering their news, right? We're all sort of tired. We're still wiping the sleep out of our eyes, and we're not judging anybody because we've all been there. And it tends to create this sort of virtual camaraderie, if you will. I also love the spontaneity of morning TV. There's a lot of opportunity for, chatting with the viewers and chatting with your co-anchors and your fellow news anchors and weather people. That part is great. It's very personality driven is another way to put that. What I didn't like was exactly what you mentioned, waking up at 12:30. That's a really brutal schedule, especially if you're doing it for decades. And when I finally had my third child, when I was at WNBC in New York, I was sort of at the end of my shelf life in the news business. I probably was well expired actually at that point, and it was time to start something new. But that said, when you're in a great newsroom, there's nothing like it. It's just a hub of activity. There's a lot of big personalities, lots of witty people who are quick on their feet and sharp thinkers, and a lot of diverse perspectives, which is awesome. I've never found a place quite like a newsroom yet.
Wow. Yeah, the 12:30 I saw one of your most recent, or probably not your most recent Instagram, but I was like, I cannot imagine waking up at that time. And was that for you just to commute into the city? Were you doing hair and makeup at that point? Like what was the 12:30 wake up call
Yeah.
for?
So it depended a little bit. When I was working in Philadelphia before I was in New York, I lived a little bit closer. So I wasn't having to get up quite as early. But when I had my third child, I was going through the whole, and I hope this isn't TMI for the audience. But I was waking up, I was nursing my child, then I was taking a shower, and I was, because there's nothing pretty when you just had a baby. Like it all needs to be cleaned up before you go to work. And then I was like pumping. So there was a bottle on hand for my husband. So that whole process, if you're a mom or a dad and you have a spouse who's nursed, it adds hours to your day. So I would do all of that to be ready to go out the door at like 2-ish. And then I would make it into the city at 3. I would sit down for hair and makeup, and, we'd have a conference call on the way in about what the main stories were, what we were going to be talking about. I'd do hair and makeup, have time to grab a coffee. And then our show began at 4 a.m. So it was like boom, 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 boom.
Wow. And all is welcome on the show, by the way. Our listeners know I'm about halfway through my first pregnancy currently.
Oh,
First child. Yeah. So even hearing all of that is interesting just on a personal level of like,
uh,
yeah, what it does take.
we should talk.
Happy to do so. Happy to do so. That's super interesting. Did you have much creative freedom in terms of the story that you were covering, or was that mostly given to you by management or whoever's really in charge?
Yeah, there's not a simple answer to that. When I was in smaller markets and there wasn't so as an anchor, you generally don't have that much leeway with, it's news, especially in the morning. It's a lot of what happened overnight and what's coming up during the day. And it's pretty regimented, meaning there's, you have 30 seconds for this and you have 2 minutes for that. If you're on a longer morning show, for example, when I worked at Fox in Philadelphia, there's a little more time for riffing and you have a little more creative leeway. At NBC, our morning show was 2 hours and we had a certain amount of news that we needed to get through. And so we didn't have as much time for like riffing or necessarily adding a lot of creative flair, if you will. In Philadelphia, our show is 7 hours long. So there's lots of time for all that good stuff. I would say in the smaller markets. So I worked in a very small market in Texas. I worked in Salt Lake City, which is like a medium-sized market. Generally speaking, there's more enterprise stories in those markets, meaning there's not as much breaking news. There's not as much in the way, of traffic, which is a staple of morning TV, which means that you're really looking for stories that are human interest or feature or not obvious, like breaking or spot news stories. In the larger markets, like for example, when I worked in Phoenix, certainly in Philadelphia and in New York, there's some room for those types of stories, but usually it's more along the lines of an investigative type story. We're covering, for the most part, breaking and spot news and a few issue related stories that are generally short and down near the end of the newscast.
So interesting. And I just thank you for kind of peeling back the curtain. So many of our listeners here, they're small business owners, they're entrepreneurs, they're founders.
Yeah.
They have the dream of being on TV. And I think this kind of conversation is really good because it's not just like, hey, pick me, but we need to think creatively about how we can actually get our foot in the door, have a conversation, or make it newsworthy, relevant, timely. It has to be those things. So,
Yeah.
one of the things that I'd love to ask you about is how do we grab the newsroom's attention? Say we have this great story or this great thing that we're doing, something we're building. How do we make that relevant for a news station?
Part of it is knowing which outlet you should be pitching to. So like, for example, and I'm just going to use my stations because I can grasp those analogies very quickly. Like when I worked on Today in New York, we didn't do features in the morning show. We just didn't have time for it. During the weekends, Today in New York weekend, we had time for, lifestyle segments, and we had time for chefs to come in, and we had time to talk about recipes and sort of human interest and lifestyle type stories. So if you're pitching, if you are a chef or a restaurant owner and you're pitching to, and again I'm just using this as an example, you're pitching to the weekday Today in New York crew, you're not getting on because we don't do that sort of stuff. So part of it is knowing where you need to pitch, understanding the platform, right? So are you pitching here? Are you pitching there? And how do you tailor what it is that you're pitching, or is it not relevant at all? So for example, if to use a podcast example, if you're pitching yourself to a podcast, but that podcast doesn't interview guests, it's a waste of your time. And it's clear that you've never watched the podcast before. So that's another dead giveaway that you haven't done your homework, you haven't done your research. So understand the outlet and understand whether your pitch is relevant to that outlet, if they'll even take it. And if they don't waste your time, because you're really only alerting the news team that you don't know what they do and you don't know their vibe and you don't know their voice.
So helpful. And there is so much research that does go into it. Like I love your example even of a podcast, because Lydia and I will get, pitches, which we love to read because we love to see like what people are saying.
Yeah.
But if they've never, we had a magician once send us a pitch for this show, which is literally focused on like media and PR. We were like, interesting. Like, that's not going to work for us.
You should have taken him or her just to see what happens.
Hey, won't you pull out your magic hat? Yeah, so I think you're spot on with the research component, and that's a really great piece of advice, that you need to know what they're actually covering and talking about, what days of the week they're talking about. One thing I saw you post on socials too, and one of the reasons that you moved away from this, which I do want to get into that story in just a moment, is that less people are watching traditional news, which
Yeah.
I'm a person who doesn't watch the news personally. So how do you think that impacts how does that impact like everything and everyone, from the business owner
Yeah.
to like the day-to-day person who watches the news or doesn't watch the news?
100%. So I shouldn't admit this, but I also don't watch TV anymore either. But that said, you may want to be on TV. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be on TV news. There's the Drew Barrymore show, and there's the Kelly Clarkson show, and there's late night, and there's a whole bunch of different options that are not solely focused on a news outlet. That said, they really are all struggling, right? Late night struggling too. People are watching streaming. The monologues are no longer as timely because people aren't watching them in the moment. They're, that's a whole nother podcast. So it's changed things in a number of ways. First of all, there's a greater distrust in the media than there has been, at least ever since I've been involved in that industry. And, fake news, the whole 9 yards. And so I do think that people are perhaps a little more reluctant's not quite the right word. They are less likely to grant immediate credibility to whatever they see on the news. That said, the people who are watching do grant immediate credibility, because if you're on, if you are, I'll use this as an example or an analogy. If you were to walk up to somebody's house and knock on their door at 4 a.m. in the morning or 4 a.m. I hate when people say 4 a.m. in the morning. That's what a.m. means. It's morning. If you were to knock on their door at 4 a.m. and start spouting off the day's news, and you just walked into their house and went and sat on the end of their bed, like, how do you think you'd be escorted out? You'd be escorted out with a baseball bat and probably a call to the police. But you're basically doing the same thing when you show up on someone's TV set at 4 in the morning, and they're watching you in bed, or they're watching you while they're having breakfast, or heck, they're watching you sometimes in the bathroom on their phone. They've already granted you credibility. And so that's why they're watching you. So for the people that are watching TV, you do have immediate credibility with them, because they know that you have been vetted and assessed by a team of producers and a team of reporters. And the TV audience is still, there's still some cachet to being on TV. It's a privilege that a lot of people don't have. That also said, it's harder than ever to get on media. And this doesn't just apply to TV, it applies to print and digital as well, because there have been, due to the contrition in that industry, there have been mass layoffs, which means you have fewer people doing more work. And so it's even more important that when you do land in their inbox, you've landed with something that's going to make them click, open, and read.
This is such a good conversation. My business partner is a publicist, and she's been a publicist for a decade, started in agencies, transitioned to her own agency. And she was just having this conversation the other day with some other publicists. Like, a lot of them have moved away from the agency model, and they're now freelancers. So it's like this whole new world of how PR is working traditionally. And like what I'm hearing from you is that this is happening in the TV space as well. And, it's something I do dance with, because I don't watch the news.
Yeah.
Personally, I like to curate like what comes into my thought stream, right?
We have to. That's like self-preservation.
We have to. And at the same time, these stations still hold credibility within subconscious, like the subconscious mind of, especially as a business owner, our audiences. So to say, okay, I was interviewed on ABC morning show or whatever it might be, it still does hold that piece of credibility.
Absolutely, 100%. And what I have found as an ex, news anchor, is that people are still sort of fascinated with, regardless of whether they watch, they're still really interested in how TV works and what it's like. And they're very intrigued by somebody who was on air, to use my example. And there is an element of, like I said, cachet that comes along with saying you were seen on, Good Morning America or the Today Show or News 12 or whatever it is. But there are some people who that's not their jive. And so I say, maybe it's like Entrepreneur or Inc. or, Forbes. There's a lot of other, or the Kelly Clarkson show or the Drew Barrymore show. There's a lot of media platforms out there that are not necessarily news and current events focused. They're business focused or their lifestyle. And those haven't taken the hit to their credibility to the degree that a lot of news channels have.
Yeah. What do you think about kind of the shift. I guess podcast is kind of independent media in a way, right? Like we have our own show, our own platform. We're able to talk about and curate the content, the stories that we and the people that we bring on. What do you
Yeah.
think about where media is going in general? Like, what do you think it's going to be like in 5 years?
Oh my gosh. If I had a magic wand or a crystal ball, I could answer that. But I think we're only going to see the news media has been sloppy about, first they were sloppy about getting their arms around the internet and how to use it to promote their stories. Then they were sloppy with getting their arms around social media. Then we all sort of sunk to the bottom of the barrel, getting baited on Twitter, aka X. Like, it has not been a clean or seamless transition from linear shows to the digital space. That said, there's a lot of news organizations that are streaming, and that in the next 5 years is going to be where things are headed. I don't honestly know at this stage how quickly that's even going to grow, because I feel like people are they're really set on having their own feed curated right here. They're not necessarily watching full news shows on whatever platform. So I think it's going to move more towards streaming, but I don't actually think that's the end destination. And I'm not sure what the end destination is.
Yeah, this is just an interesting conversation because I
Yeah.
think with the shift away from traditional platforms, those companies have a lot of money to produce the shows. Then you
Yep.
have these independents starting and they don't have all the money that a big production company has. So that's where you get into like a little bit more of the pay to play space where they need
Yep.
to cover production costs through the payment. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think we'll continue to see more of the pay to play? Do you like the traditional model in that way where you don't need to?
Yeah, I don't like pay to play, and the reason is because I feel like listen, I get pitched for like a million awards in my LinkedIn DMs all the time. We're considering you for the top, 20 female, blah 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 blah. It's just a one low price of $2,500 to be thrown into the mix. I'm like, well, how important is this award? Like, I have to pay you to be involved, and that's sort of the way that I view. Maybe it's just the cynic in me, or the former like journalist who wants news to be very pure and not have that element in it. But I don't like the pay to play model. That said, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad choice for the right outlet and the right person. I've seen huge creators, people who have millions of people on social and who've been featured all over the place, pay good money to be seen on the cover of Us Weekly. I don't think it's going to do anything for their clients or their lead gen, but there's like some cachet to say I was seen on the cover of Us Weekly or whatever. So to answer your question, I don't love pay to play, but I do see like even the larger platforms, like some of the big network morning shows, are using pay to play within their news programs. And so I don't see that changing anytime soon. And it's really just up to the person who's considering, or the business who's considering being featured, how important it is and what it'll do for their visibility, credibility, revenue goals.
Exactly. And, this is a big reason that we even wanted the show in the first place, to kind of peel back the curtain and just talk about everything that's going on, right? You can always do it organically, which is like what we teach. That's like the path that we show. It's like,
Yep.
you don't need to pay for this. And yet you're always going to run across someone in your inbox sending you, $500 and you'll get this article in Forbes, or
Yeah.
that's actually probably really low for Forbes,
Yeah.
but you understand, what I'm
Yeah.
saying. So it's like, we educate the people and then they have to make the right decision, what is right and true for them. So I appreciate your thoughts on that too.
Yeah.
So interesting where everything is going.
It is. And you mentioned podcasts, and I didn't really get a chance to touch on that, but I do think podcasts now for the business owner are sort of like the equivalent of having written a book if you host your own podcast. And while podcasts may not necessarily have the millions of daily listeners or weekly listeners the way a network show may have, you do have a very targeted niche audience. And if it's the right audience for you, just because there's 1,000 people listening to it versus 10,000 on a morning show, there are 1,000 people of exactly the people you need to be in front of. And so despite the fact that it's not quantity, it's quality. So there's definitely some benefits of being on podcasts as well. That's
Yeah.
why I'm here.
That's over here. I love it. And couldn't agree more. So I kind of want to shift into what you're doing now. And I think one of the segues for that conversation, one of the things that you said you'd love to talk about is like how to tweak any story into a good one, which I think probably lays into the work that you're doing now too.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you are going to be pitching to a hard news, right? The key is finding something that is timely, something that is sort of piggybacking on something that is playing in the news. So an example of that might be if you are a doctor and an orthopedic doctor, let's say, and somebody on your local NFL team has an injury that could keep them out of play. Oh, that's a really easy pitch. I can talk about what that injury is, what it means to the player, what it likely means to the team, and how it affects his or her, what their trajectory is for the rest of the season. If you are a divorce lawyer or you counsel people in divorce, as of this recording, there's recent news that J-Lo and Ben Affleck are getting divorced. So you can piggyback on something like that and talk about, I don't know, navigating divorce for the first holiday that your respective families are going through, or what does it mean that they didn't have a prenup? I don't think they had a prenup. There's a way that you can spin off of what's going on in the news. If you're pitching to a Forbes or, a Drew Barrymore or an entrepreneur or a podcast for that matter, you can create stories that are more evergreen, meaning they're not necessarily tied to something that is taking place in the news in that moment. And while having some urgency to your pitch, meaning you are tied to a specific event, does increase the likelihood that you'll get picked up. An evergreen pitch can be pitched a ton of different times. So you pitch it once, it doesn't get picked up. You can tweak it a little bit, change some things and pitch it again, or pitch it to another outlet. So it gives you an opportunity to keep sort of dipping into that journalist's ecosystem, if you will, and establishing a little bit of credibility every time as long as your pitch is good, every time your name shows up in their inbox. The key though is to not do the spray and pray. So you're not sending the same pitch to every single person. You're not sending the same pitch to TV that you would necessarily send to a newspaper. You can pitch the same story, but the angle might be slightly different. I like to say that TV sort of likes the quote unquote naughtier version of the story, meaning they like something that has maybe a little bit of conflict or a little bit of drama. For example, I worked with a client who is a career development coach and a job hunt coach. And we were crafting a story for her about the job market for recent college grads. And so when we pitched that story to her newspaper, it was, here are, the 5 things that recent college grads are going to need to navigate. And there was actually another angle as a parent of a recent college grads. Here are the things that you need to, they might be moving back in with you. They're whatever, blah, 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 blah. I don't remember the 5 tips exactly. But when we pitched that same story to her TV stations, we pitched it again, right? Recent college grads, but we added a more urgent element to the story, which was at that time, there were a lot of college protests going on having to do with what's going on in Gaza. And so the pitch also centered, right? Again, to make it a little more timely, because TV news has a much shorter shelf life, right? The stories expire. There's a shorter lead time, if you will, than there is for an evergreen story. We pitched what taking part in those protests could do to your job prospects. You're doing this, whether it's direct or whether you're on social media, here's how it's going to affect you. So I use the word naughty in that case. It's not exactly the right word, but there is a sense of conflict and urgency that goes along with it that was absent in the newspaper pitch.
That is such a great tip. And I guess naughty, I know where you're going in that. they want numbers, right? They need,
Numbers.
what are people going to be like, "Ah, ooh, interesting. I want to know more." Like they want that response from the
Yeah,
viewer and the person watching it. So it is a little bit like fine line. Probably works a little bit
100%.
better there.
Yeah, and the thing about the newspaper pitch is that you might say, "Oh, I need to read that, but it's not urgent right now, and maybe you'll come back to it." But you don't have that option really with television, not as much as you used to anyway. And so if you're going to watch it and you're interested in the story, you need something that's going to grab them in the moment and make this an urgent, for the parent who's saying, why can't my kid find a job? Oh my gosh, look at what's on your social media. You've been posting all this kinds of stuff. No wonder nobody's calling you for an interview. So it creates that, again, that conflict or that urgency.
I think the beautiful thing about understanding the pitch and the positioning is, for a business owner, this can help them in so many different facets.
Yeah.
When it comes to sales, we always have to be thinking about, okay, who are we talking to and what matters to them? And it's that
Mhm.
same idea is like, who are we communicating the message to, and how do we communicate it in the way, in the timeliness, in the language that matters to them? Because of course we think our stuff is the bee's knees. Of course we do. Like that is what we need as a business owner, but it really is about how can we frame or position or shift in a way that matters to those outside of us.
100%. I think where so many pitches fall flat is that they move to sort of a marketing dynamic rather than a news dynamic. Like, unless you're, J.K. Rowling or Stephen King, nobody actually cares that you're releasing a book. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm sure it's an amazing book and you're probably an amazing person, but that's not newsworthy. What is newsworthy is you've got, 3 tips in this book that teach you how to let go of core trauma and live your best life, or whatever it is. That's not exactly what you would say, but you get the idea. That's the part that's newsworthy. Talking about your book being launched is marketing. It's not news. And does that add any value to the audience? And then you have to understand as well that you're not pitching it directly to the audience. You're pitching it to sort of a middleman who is going to have to decipher how this is helpful, not to him or her, but to the audience. And the inverse is you are actually being helpful to this person. You're helping them do their job by finding something that's of value to their audience, but they still have to decipher what it is. So 9 times out of 10, that may be a little grand, but what I would say is this: the majority of times that pitches fail, and not because it's not, timely or newsworthy, is because that people are leaning into marketing versus news.
Gold nuggets of wisdom right here. I love this. So tell us a little bit more about what you're up to now and how you're helping business owners more on like the media training side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. So I work with small business owners, certainly, and also executives and founders, and in 2 slightly different ways. For small business owners, I work with them also in helping them establish media, but I do media training. So understanding how to talk effectively to a camera. And really this applies not just to media opportunities, it applies to video content that you may be creating, it applies to virtual panels and virtual events that you may be a part of. But really it is understanding how to communicate effectively. That includes things like understanding what your stories are, understanding what your sound bites are, understanding how to put them together, understanding how to be energetically supportive of your host, how to rock an interview, whether you're in studio or you're on a video platform. And on the executive side, they may not necessarily be immediately intrigued by a news program, and they're definitely not pitching themselves because they have PR in-house. But what they are interested in is learning how to communicate effectively on camera so that they can deliver virtual town halls, or they can deliver on virtual panels, or hybrid or virtual events, longer form stuff versus social.
It makes so much sense. And it's so beautiful that you've been able to. I always think of life like these little breadcrumbs and puzzle pieces. And it's
Yeah.
like you had this 20-year career doing this one thing. You picked up all of these skills and these talents, and these abilities. And now you're able to just like beautifully weave that into what you're doing now, which it sounds like is a little bit more in line with your lifestyle and being a mom and all those things.
Yes, I'm not waking up at 12:30.
What time do you wake up now?
As late as I possibly can. I'm still dealing with PTSD from my 12:30 alarm. I'm like, oh, it's 7:30. Do I have to get up now? Yes, I do. No, it's a more reasonable hour. That much I can tell you.
What time did you go to bed if you had to wake up at
Oh,
12:30?
it was so awful. It was so awful. When I didn't have kids and I was doing the morning show, I could be very, very regimented about my schedule. And I would go to bed if I was waking up at 12:30, I would go to bed at 4:30 and I would black out my room and I would sleep with a little bit of melatonin. Once I started having kids, it was I was a disaster. I would come home, I would sleep for like an hour or two. Then the kids would come home from school, and then it would be like activities and homework and dinner and bath and bed. And then I would go and sleep for like nap, not sleep. I would nap for like another 2 hours. And that's how I lived Monday through Friday. It like, yeah, I could barely drool by the time I was done. It was not pleasant, nor was it pretty.
I can only imagine. Gosh, God bless. That's
Yeah.
incredible. Anything else to share with our audience? Anything exciting that you have going on? Any kind of final words of wisdom?
Final words of wisdom is, you know, one of the things I picked up when I was in the media is that the people who really were successful on camera were the ones who were as similar on camera as they were off. And like, I use Gordon Ramsay as an example. Like, he's kind of a jerk on camera, but people love him. He's kind of a jerk off camera too, but people love him as well. It is helpful to be nice and relatable and likable on camera, but the real true key is being yourself. Generally, that means taking exactly who you are off camera and just bumping it up a little bit with the energy when you're in front of the lens. So when you're practicing, think about talking in a way that you would in a voice that you would use if you were in a crowded restaurant and you were trying to talk to somebody across the room. Like, it's you, but about 25% more. What I have coming up is I'm getting ready to launch a group media training program. If anybody is interested in checking it out, you can find me on LinkedIn. I've been posting about it there, and there's links for free strategy calls if you'd like to talk a little bit about your on-camera presence or media training. And I look forward to talking to anybody who may be interested.
Amazing. Amazing. This has been such a fun conversation, honestly. So glad that we have connected through the internet, but also are very close in physical proximity
Yes.
as well. So, yeah, thank you so much, Kerry, for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for having me. It was great. You're a great interviewer.
Thank you. I love doing this. It's very fun.
I can tell.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for listening to another episode of Visibility Era, the podcast. We'll be back next week.